back, relax, and maybe get yourself a snack. Me and you gonna have a little chat about books. Hi guys! So I'm here today to tell you about 3 books that I listened to on Audible very recently and that I really enjoyed. So let's get into them. The first one I have to talk to you about is called Stiff. This is a non-fiction by Mary Roach and the audiobook was narrated by Shelley Frazier, I think is how you say her name. I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook of this. I don't own a physical copy, but the audiobook was a whole lot of fun. I didn't really know what to expect going into this book, I must admit, because it's a book about dead people, and Mary Roach is a very well-established researcher. She kind of does a lot of research into various different topics that she finds interesting, and one of those happens to be dead bodies, and she kind of looked into the science of what happens when people donate their bodies to science, and after they have died, what happens to those cadavers. They are called like dead bodies. It's kind of really gross and kind of really interesting all at once, and I really liked having someone narrate it to me because it felt a bit more like being in a lecture or being told this sort of stuff by a real scientist or professor. She comes across really well in her book because she's actually very approachable and her writing style is very easy to get into. But I still felt like I learned an awful lot from this book, like stuff I would never have just researched on my own, but I found absolutely fascinating. And I think having the narration really enhanced my listening experience, my reading experience, and made this whole thing just really great. I do definitely want to read more of her books in the future, and I think if you're interested at all in science, or if you just have a morbid curiosity like I do, then this is a sort of book that I think you'll really enjoy. I do think non-fiction works well when it's narrated, and when it's not too heavily factual, and I think this book has a good balance of really interesting quirky facts that will keep you grossed out and excited all at once, and also it tells you a lot that you just would never have realised or never thought about, and it approaches those topics in some really interesting ways. So I would definitely recommend this audiobook or the physical book. I'm sure that's just as great. I don't know if it has pictures of dead bodies, that would be too creepy, hopefully not, but I don't own the physical book, so I don't know. Anyway, if you've read it, let me know if there are creepy pictures in the physical one, or if you've listened to it, then let me know that as well. I think I ended up giving Stiff 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. It was definitely a fun read, and I will definitely be picking up more of her books in the future. Hopefully on audio if there's some. I haven't looked into it yet, but I'm looking forward to listening or reading more of her books. The next one I have to talk about is actually a really great one for me because this one was narrated by the author herself, and that author is Laura Bates, who is the author of Everyday Sexism. This book is again a non-fiction one. It's one that I think worked really well audio format again because this is the author telling you with the correct intonations and the correct pauses and information and tone of voice about this really heavy topic, which is sexism. Sexism is something that is obviously very rampant in our society today, whether people choose to believe it or not, it is, and it's definitely something that affects both men and women and anyone who describes themselves as any other genders. It's certainly not just a thing that affects women or that is not real anymore. It's definitely something that is very present in today's society still. I think this book comes at it in a very interesting way because it talks about various different setups where people have had sexism done against them. It was basically this idea that Laura Bates had to say something about the sexism she was experiencing, and she set up a blog and she talked about this sexism that she had on a regular basis, and other people started leaving their comments and their thoughts about stuff that had happened to them that they regarded as sexist, and over the years and time, loads and loads of people, I mean all over the world, people were coming to this website and they were putting in what had happened to them. But the really good thing is that it wasn't just a place of sorrow and unhappiness and drudgery and sadness. It was definitely a place where people were encouraging each other and being allies to one another and helping each other to realise that it wasn't okay, it wasn't acceptable, it shouldn't have to be something that people should deal with on a regular basis, to be harassed or to be catcalled or any of those sorts of things. And I think it brought a real community together and started a real movement that Laura Bates has then gone on to further by doing TED Talks and writing books and all sorts of other things. So I'm really happy that I finally got around to reading this. I'd already seen her TED Talk a few months before I read it, and I really liked that, but the book is kind of a bigger expansion and a much more thorough look at some of the cases that she came across. I do think it only kind of touches the surface on this issue. There's obviously so much more that she could have gone into, and she doesn't. Listening to the audiobook of this one was fantastic fun, and I do think always, if you can find a book that is narrated by the author themselves, that is usually a fantastic way to consume a book, because they know exactly what they're trying to say and they can say it very well, and I think it works incredibly well, both with non-fiction and with fiction. So I always try and find out if the author does narrate the audiobook, and if they do, more than likely I will listen to the audiobook instead of reading it. However, I will probably pick up a copy of both this one and Stiff at some point in the future. And again, I think I gave this a 3.5 or 4, definitely a higher rating. I really enjoyed it and the audiobook was great. So the final one I have to talk to you about, I actually do have a physical copy of, but I did listen to the audio for and then bought this because I loved it so much, and that is Wild Swans by Zheng Cheng. This is a Chinese author, and she is telling the story of her life, her mother's life, and her grandmother's life. So it's 3 different generations, and she is telling their story. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Pixen Lim. I thought the audiobook was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. It was narrated beautifully. I thought it was handled really well. Obviously, it's not the author herself, but I just felt like it gave a real tone of voice to the story and really made me connect with these characters on a personal level. This is probably the most personal out of the 3 I've mentioned to you, because it is a real account or biography of their lives, autobiography I suppose, and it's really personal. There are some moments that are just heartbreaking and devastating and really sad, because these 3 women, all of them lived throughout the reign of Mao in China, and there are various things that go on throughout the reign of Mao which are just horrendous for people who live in China, even people who come from good families or families that are favoured by the Mao regime. They're not safe, and she actually came from a fairly well-off family who were favoured, but still things were pretty terrible at times. So I found this whole story, this whole multi-generational story, fascinating. I didn't know anything about China's history, to be honest. I knew that Mao was someone who was looked at as a kind of dictator. That's all I really knew about him, to be honest, and this book opened my eyes to a lot more about the history of the regime, the kind of coming of age of it, the dawn of the fantastic Mao days, and then the fall of his empire and what happened to him and what happened to the people who were supporting him, what happened to those who would not support him. It was just really eye-opening and interesting to learn about China's history a bit more than I knew, because to be honest I didn't know anything, and I'm really fascinated by it. I would love to read some more on the topic, I definitely will be, but the thing that came across most well to me in the audiobook was that this is beautifully written. It's a real wonderful account of these 3 really strong, powerful women who, they may not have had like political power as such, but they were strong for each other, and they were strong because they had to be, and they had no choice. And eventually, when Mao and his empire collapsed, that's when the daughter Zheng Chang managed to get out and go to England and write this book and publish it and all of that sort of stuff. And I think it's just really fascinating and wonderful to me how eye-opening this book is. It's fairly old now, I think. Yeah, it came out in 1991 originally, so it's definitely a fairly old read now, but I found it so eye-opening and so interesting, so I would certainly recommend this, particularly if you have any interest in China or if you want to know about China, because like I say, I was a complete novice. I didn't know anything about the history, and this book really opened my eyes and told me a lot and really made me feel empathy and sympathy for people living under these horrible conditions. And I found it so fascinating. I find other cultures really fascinating, and this was beautifully told. So I'd love to hear your thoughts if you've read this or the other 2 books I just mentioned. Do leave them down below, or if you're planning to pick them up, let me know that too. I think this one was definitely my favourite of the 3, however I would recommend all of them because I think they're all fantastic, and I love the audiobooks of all of them as well. So thank you all so much for watching. I will see you all very soon in another video. Bye!
Thank you for watching my video today. Go pick up a book, then come back and chat with me again.